I'm Emily, 33, sitting in a stuffy lawyer's office, my son Jacob's small hand in mine. The room's packed with family, their expensive suits and whispers making me feel small. My sister Ashley smirks at my Uncle Raymond, their eyes glinting with something cruel. I'm here for Dad's will reading, but my heart's racing, wondering if his final words will prove I was never enough. Jacob doodles a heart on my palm, steadying me. Have you ever felt judged before you could speak? I'm sharing this story from my heart. Where are you listening from? Hit subscribe if it resonates, and let's walk this journey together. The lawyer, Mr. Harris, cleared his throat, his glasses slipping down his nose as he unfolded Dad's will. The room went quiet, save for the soft rustle of papers. I shifted in my chair, Jacob's hand still warm in mine, his pencil pausing on the little sketch he'd started on a napkin. My sister Ashley leaned forward, her pearl earrings catching the light, her lips curled in a way that made my stomach twist. Uncle Raymond sat beside her, his arms crossed, a faint smirk tugging at his mouth. I tried to focus, but their glances felt like needles. Mr. Harris's voice was steady, cutting through the tension. He listed Dad's assets first, the sprawling estate upstate, the stock portfolio, the lakefront cabin where we'd spent summers as kids. My chest tightened as he read to my daughter Ashley. I leave the estate and half the stock holdings. Ashley gasped, her hand flying to her chest, but it felt rehearsed, like she'd practiced it in a mirror. She turned to Nathan, our cousin, her eyes gleaming. Nathan nodded, his jaw tight, but he wouldn't meet my gaze. Then came Nathan's share. To my nephew Nathan, I leave the cabin and the remaining stock holdings. Nathan exhaled, his shoulders relaxing, and Ashley squeezed his arm, whispering something that made him smile. I sat there frozen, my fingers clenching Jacob's a little too hard. He looked up, his brown eyes wide, searching my face for answers I didn't have. The room seemed to shrink, the air heavy with the weight of what wasn't being said. I swallowed, my throat dry, waiting for my name. Maybe Dad left me something small, a token, anything to show he'd seen me. I pictured the old shed behind the cabin where I'd spent hours as a kid painting on scraps of wood. Maybe he'd thought of that. But Mr. Harris kept reading, detailing smaller bequests, a vintage car to Raymond, a trust fund for Clara's grandkids. My name didn't come up, not once. Aunt Clara, sitting across the table, leaned toward her husband, her voice loud enough for me to hear. Emily never deserved his trust, you know. Always chasing dreams instead of building something real. Her words landed like a slap, and I felt my cheeks burn. A few heads nodded, their murmurs blending into a low hum of agreement. I wanted to shrink into the floor, to disappear with Jacob and never come back. I flashed back to a moment from high school, standing in our living room, holding a canvas I'd poured my heart into. It was a sunset, all oranges and purples, inspired by the lake. I'd been so proud showing it to Dad, hoping for once he'd smile. But he'd barely looked up from his newspaper. Art's a hobby, Emily, not a future, he'd said, his voice flat. Ashley, sitting on the couch, had smirked, her perfect report card in hand, soaking up his praise. That memory stung, now sharp and raw, as Clara's words echoed in my head. Jacob's hand twitched in mine, pulling me back to the room. His pencil lay still on the napkin, his sketch half finished, a lopsided tree that looked like it was wilting. I forced a smile, wanting to shield him from the tension, but my lips trembled. He didn't smile back. His small fingers tightened around mine, like he was trying to hold me together. Mr. Harris paused, adjusting his glasses, and I held my breath, hoping for something, anything. He flipped a page, his brow furrowing slightly, and I leaned forward, my heart pounding. Maybe there was more. Maybe Dad had saved something for me, a final gesture to show he cared. But then Ashley spoke, her voice sharp and cutting through the silence. Let's move on, Mr. Harris. We all know Emily's not getting anything. Dad made that clear years ago. The room seemed to tilt. My breath caught, and I felt Jacob stiffen beside me. Ashley's words hung in the air, heavy and final, and no one contradicted her. Not Nathan, not Raymond, not even Clara, who just pursed her lips and looked away. I stared at the table at a chipped coffee mug sitting there, one I'd painted for Dad when I was 15. Blue swirls and a clumsy heart made with all the love I could muster. It was just sitting there, ignored like it didn't matter. Like I didn't. I stared at that chipped mug, my vision blurring as Ashley's words echoed in my head. The room felt hotter, the air pressing against my chest. Mr. Harris coughed, flipping another page, his voice droning on about some charity donation Dad had set up. I barely heard him. My pulse thumped in my ears, and I could feel every pair of eyes in the room judging, waiting for me to crack. Jacob shifted closer, his shoulder brushing mine, and I wanted to scoop him up and run. Clara's husband, Greg, leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. He muttered something to Nathan, who chuckled softly, covering his mouth like a kid hiding a secret. I caught the tail end of it. Always been a burden. My stomach lurched. I'd never been close to Greg, but hearing him pile on stung like a fresh cut. I glanced at Jacob, praying he hadn't heard, but his head was down, his fingers twisting the napkin into a tight ball. I tried to steady my breathing, focusing on the cool metal of the chair under my palms. I told myself it didn't matter what they thought. I'd built a life for Jacob and me, scraping by with my part-time job at the community center, teaching art to kids who reminded me of him. But the truth was, I'd always hoped Dad saw more in me. That one day he'd look past my choices, past the single mom label, and see the daughter who'd tried so hard to make him proud. A memory hit me sharp and unbidden. I was 20, standing in Dad's study, my hands shaking as I told him I was pregnant. Jacob's father was already gone, a fleeting mistake who'd left me with nothing but a broken lease and a positive test. I'd looked at Dad, hoping for comfort, but his face had hardened. "You've thrown your life away, Emily," he'd said, turning back to his desk. "Don't expect me to fix this." Ashley had been there, hovering in the doorway, her silence louder than any words. That moment had carved a hole in me, one I'd spent years trying to fill. Mr. Harris's voice pulled me back. He was reading a clause about Dad's old boat, left to a distant cousin I barely knew. The murmurs in the room grew louder, family members nodding some jotting notes. I felt invisible, like I was fading into the wallpaper. Then Clara spoke again, her voice sharp enough to slice through the chatter. "It's no surprise, really. Emily's always been the odd one out. Dad knew she'd squander anything he gave her." My breath hitched. I wanted to scream, to tell her she was wrong, that I'd fought for every scrap of stability Jacob and I had. But my throat closed up, the words stuck like stones. Jacob's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing at Clara. I squeezed his hand, willing him to stay quiet, but I could see the hurt in his face, the way his jaw tightened. He was only 10, but he understood more than I wanted him to. Ashley leaned toward Raymond, her voice low but clear. "She's probably here just to beg for scraps." Pathetic. Raymond snorted, his laugh grating against my nerves. A few others shifted their chairs, scraping the floor, and I caught Nathan's wife, Elise, glancing my way. Her face was unreadable, but she didn't laugh. For a second, I thought she might say something, but she looked down at her hands, folding them neatly in her lap. I flashed back again, this time to a family dinner a few years ago. Dad had been sick, his cough rattling through the house, but he'd insisted on hosting. I'd brought Jacob, hoping to mend things, to show Dad we were doing okay. But Ashley had dominated the night, talking about her new job, her fiancé, her perfect life. Dad had hung on her every word, his eyes bright with pride. When I'd mentioned Jacob's school art show, he'd nodded absently, already turning back to Ashley. I'd left that night feeling like a ghost in my own family. Now, in this suffocating room, that feeling was back heavier than ever, Mr. Harris closed the will with a soft thud, his hands folding over the pages. "That covers the primary distributions," he said, adjusting his tie. "We'll move to minor bequests next." My heart sank lower, if that was even possible. Minor bequests. Was that all I'd get? A trinket, a pity gift, or nothing at all? I looked at Jacob, his napkin now, a crumpled mess, his eyes fixed on the table. I wanted to tell him it was okay that we didn't need Dad's money or their approval, but the lie wouldn't come. My hands trembled, and I tucked them under my thighs, hoping no one noticed. Clara's words, Ashley's sneer, Greg's mutter, they all swirled in my head, each one a brick in a wall I couldn't climb. Then Raymond spoke, his voice loud, meant for everyone. "Let's be honest, Emily's lucky to be here at all. Dad always said she was a disappointment." The room went still, the weight of his words settling over us like dust. Jacob's head jerked up, his eyes flashing, and I felt a surge of panic. I gripped his hand tighter, my heart racing, knowing this moment was about to get worse. Raymond's words hung in the air, sharp and heavy, like a blade left to rust. My heart pounded so hard, I thought it might crack my ribs. Jacob's hand stiffened in mine, his small frame trembling, and I knew he'd heard every syllable. I wanted to shield him, to pull him close and whisper that none of this was true, but my body wouldn't move. The room was a blur of faces, some smirking, some looking away, but all of them complicit in this moment. Mr. Harris cleared his throat, his fingers fumbling with the will's pages, but before he could speak, Ashley leaned forward, her voice dripping with venom. "Raymond's right. Dad told me plenty of times how you let him down, Emily. Chasing your little art dreams, dragging that kid around like a burden." She flicked her eyes toward Jacob, and my blood boiled. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out, my throat tight with a rage I didn't know how to unleash. Jacob's chair scraped softly as he shifted, his eyes locked on Ashley, wide and fierce. I squeezed his hand silently, begging him to stay still. He didn't need to hear. This didn't need to carry the weight of their cruelty. But Ashley wasn't done. She turned to Nathan, her smile cold. "Remember how Dad said she'd never amount to anything?" "This proves it." Nathan nodded, his lips twitching into a smirk, and that small gesture cut deeper than Ashley's words. Nathan, who'd always been kind enough at family gatherings, who'd once helped me fix a flat tire when I was stranded. I'd thought he was different, but now he sat there, basking in her approval, his silence louder than any insult. I flashed back to a moment years ago, standing in Dad's garage, my hands smudged with paint. I'd been working on a mural for a school project, pouring every ounce of myself into it. Dad had walked in, his face tired from a long day, and I'd hoped he'd notice. Instead, he'd sighed, shaking his head. "You're wasting your time, Emily. You think this'll pay the bills?" His voice had been heavy, not cruel, but it had crushed me all the same. I'd gone to bed that night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd ever be enough. Now, in this suffocating office, that old wound split open. Clara reached into her purse, pulling out a stack of glossy photos, her movements deliberate. She passed them around the table, her voice syrupy with false nostalgia. "These are from Dad's last trip with Ashley and Nathan. Look how happy he was." The photos made their way around, hands grabbing them eagerly, voices murmuring approval. I caught a glimpse, Dad laughing by the lake, Ashley's arm around him, Nathan holding a fishing rod. Not one picture had me in it. Not one. My chest burned, a mix of anger and grief I couldn't untangle. I wanted to grab those photos, tear them to pieces, scream that I'd been there too in the moments they didn't see. The late nights when Dad was sick, when I'd sat by his hospital bed reading him his favorite detective novels, while Ashley was too busy to visit. But they'd erased me, rewritten the story to make me the failure. Jacob's voice broke through, soft but piercing. "Why are they so mean, Mom?" His words were a whisper, meant only for me, but they landed like a thunderclap in my heart. I looked down at him, his eyes glassy, his small hands clenched into fists. My throat closed up, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek before I could stop it. I wiped it away quickly, hoping no one noticed, but Clara's sharp gaze flicked toward me, her lips pursing with something like satisfaction. Mr. Harris finally spoke, his voice cutting through the haze.
"There's one more item to address."
He adjusted his glasses, his tone careful, like he was stepping into a minefield. "To my daughter, Emily, I leave the shed behind the cabin for her to fix up if she ever learns responsibility." The words hit like a punch, knocking the air from my lungs. The shed, that crumbling, weather-beaten shack barely standing where I'd hidden as a kid to escape Dad's lectures. It wasn't a gift. It was a judgment, a final stamp of his disappointment. Ashley burst out laughing, the sound high and cruel, echoing off the walls. A shack for a slacker. Perfect. She clapped her hands like it was the punchline to a joke she'd been waiting to tell. Raymond joined in, his deep chuckle grating against my nerves. Even Greg snorted, shaking his head. The room spun, their laughter blending into a roar that drowned out everything else. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles white, trying to anchor myself before I fell apart. The laughter clawed at me, each sound a splinter under my skin. I sat there, nailed to my chair, my hands gripping the table so hard my fingers ached. Jacob's small body pressed closer, his warmth the only thing keeping me from shattering. I couldn't look at him, couldn't face the questions in his eyes. The room pulsed with their voices, their smug certainty that I was nothing, that Dad had seen me as nothing. My heart felt like it was drowning in tar, heavy and slow. Ashley's laugh tapered off, but her eyes stayed on me, sharp and gleeful, like a cat toying with a broken bird. She leaned toward Raymond, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Honestly, Emily, did you think Dad would leave you anything real? You've been a mess since high school." Her words sliced clean through me, and I felt my breath catch jagged and raw. I wanted to scream that she didn't know me, that she'd never bothered to, but my lips stayed sealed, traitors to my rage. Raymond nodded, his thick fingers drumming on the table, each tap a hammer against my resolve. "She's got no place expecting more." Dad always said she'd never grow up. His tone was casual, like he was discussing the weather, but it landed like a fist. I flashed back to a Christmas years ago, sitting at Dad's dining table, my hands folded in my lap. I'd been 25, Jacob a toddler, and I'd brought a homemade ornament, a clumsy star I'd painted for the tree. Dad had taken it, barely glancing, and set it aside. "Nice try, Emily," he'd said, then turned to Ashley's store-bought crystal angels gushing over their shine. I'd smiled through it, but that night I'd cried in my car, Jacob asleep in the back seat. Now that same dismissal echoed in Raymond's voice, in the way Nathan's smirk hadn't faded. Lise, Nathan's wife, shifted in her seat, her fingers twisting a napkin, but she said nothing. I'd hoped for a glance, a hint of sympathy, but her eyes stayed down, locked on her hands. The silence from her, from everyone who didn't laugh but didn't defend me, was its own kind of betrayal. It pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. Clara stood smoothing her skirt, and started passing around another photo, this one of Dad, at a gala, Ashley on his arm, in a glittering dress. He was so proud of her, Clara said, her voice thick with reverence, handing the picture to Greg. He took it, nodding, and passed it on. The photo never reached me, but I saw it from across the table. Dad's rare smile, the one I'd chased my whole life, given so freely to Ashley. My stomach twisted, a sick heat spreading through me. I'd never been in those moments, never been the daughter he'd wanted to show off. A new voice cut in, one I hadn't expected. Laura, my ex-husband's sister, sat at the far end of the table, her gold bracelet jangling as she waved a hand. You know, Emily came to Dad a few years back begging for cash to cover her rent. He told me himself how pathetic it was. Her words were a lie twisted from a single moment when I'd asked Dad for a loan, not for me, but for Jacob's medical bills after a bad flu. I'd paid it back every cent, but Laura's version spread like wildfire, heads nodding, whispers growing. My face burned, and I felt Jacob's gaze, his confusion like a weight I couldn't carry. I wanted to stand, to tell them the truth, to throw Laura's lie back in her face. But my legs were lead, my voice buried under years of swallowing my pain. I flashed back to another moment, one I hadn't thought of in years. I was 16, sitting in Dad's study, showing him a sketch I'd done of our old dog Max. I'd spent weeks on it, perfecting every line. He'd glanced at it, then handed it back. You're not focused, Emily. Ashley's studying for college. What are you doing? That question had haunted me, a shadow I couldn't outrun. Mr. Harris flipped another page, his voice a distant hum as he read some final notes, but I couldn't focus. The room was too loud, too close. Their voices a chorus of contempt. Ashley whispered something to Nathan, and they both laughed, their heads bent together like conspirators. Clara sat back down, her eyes flicking to me, not with kindness, but with a cold curiosity, like she was studying a wreck. Laura's bracelet jingled again, a grating rhythm that matched my racing pulse. Jacob's hand slipped from mine, and I looked down to see him staring at the floor, his napkin shredded in his lap. His shoulders were hunched, his face pale, and my heart broke open. He shouldn't be here, shouldn't be hearing this. I wanted to protect him, to make him believe we were enough, but their words were sinking into him, too poisoning the air we shared. My hands shook, my nails digging into my palms, and I felt a fury I'd never known mixed with a grief so deep it threatened to swallow me whole. My fury churned, a storm trapped in my chest, but it was Jacob's hunched shoulders that broke me. His small hands, still clutching that shredded napkin, trembled in his lap, and I felt a crack split through my heart. The room's cruelty had reached him, and I couldn't shield him anymore. Mr. Harris's voice droned on, finalizing minor bequests, his words a distant hum against the roar in my head. I stared at the table, my vision swimming, ready to grab Jacob and leave this place behind forever. Ashley's chair creaked as she leaned back. Her lips curled in a satisfied smirk, whispering to Nathan about her plans for the estate. Clara folded her hands, her face smug, while Laura's bracelet jingled faintly, a mocking rhythm. I felt their judgment pressing down, a weight I'd carried my whole life, now crushing me in this moment. My hands shook, and I tucked them under the table, my nails biting into my palms. I was done, ready to walk away from Dad's shadow, from their poison. Then Jacob moved. His small body straightened, and before I could stop him, he pushed his chair back, the scrape loud enough to cut through the room's murmur. He stood, his 10-year-old frame, tiny but unyielding. His brown eyes blazing with something I'd never seen in him before. My breath caught panic surging as I reached for his arm, but he didn't waver. His voice rang out clear and steady, slicing through the air like a bell. You forgot the video he recorded. The room froze. Ashley's smirk vanished, her mouth half open. Raymond's fingers stopped drumming, his eyes narrowing. Clara's hands twitched in her lap, and even Laura's bracelet went silent. Mr. Harris blinked, his glasses slipping as he fumbled with the will, his brow creasing in confusion. My heart stopped, my mind racing to catch up. A video I'd heard Jacob mention it once months ago, something about Grandpa recording a message for him on an old camera. I'd brushed it off, thinking it was just a kid's imagination, a story to cope with Dad's death. But now, Jacob's certainty anchored me, and I felt a spark of something dangerous hope. Mr. Harris cleared his throat, his voice hesitant. A video I don't recall any mention of. He trailed off, flipping through his notes, his fingers trembling slightly. Jacob didn't flinch, his gaze locked on the lawyer, his small chest rising and falling with quick breaths. I wanted to pull him back to protect him from whatever was coming, but his courage held me still. My eyes darted to Ashley, her face paling, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. Nathan shifted, his smirk gone, replaced by a flicker of unease. I flashed back to a moment I'd buried a day last summer when Jacob had run into my room. His face lit up. "Grandpa showed me his camera, Mom. He said he's making something special for us." I'd been distracted juggling bills and a leaking faucet, and I'd nodded absently, assuming it was just Dad humoring him. Now that memory burned a clue, I'd missed a thread to something I couldn't yet grasp. Mr. Harris rummaged through a leather folder, his movements frantic, papers rustling loudly in the silent room. My pulse thundered, my hands clammy, as I watched him pull out a small, unlabeled USB drive, its black plastic glinting under the fluorescent lights. "This was with the file," he said, almost to himself, his voice uncertain. He looked at Jacob, then at me, his eyes searching for answers I didn't have. My stomach twisted, a mix of dread and anticipation, like standing at the edge of a cliff. Ashley's voice broke the silence, sharp and unsteady. "That's ridiculous. There's no video. He's just a kid making things up." She laughed, but it was brittle, her eyes darting to Raymond for support. He didn't laugh back, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the USB drive. Clara leaned forward, her lips pursed, while Laura whispered something to Greg, her voice too low to catch. Elise, silent until now, looked up, her eyes meeting mine for a fleeting moment, a spark of curiosity in them. Mr. Harris hesitated, holding the drive like it might burn him. "I'll need to verify this," he said, his tone cautious, but he moved to his laptop, plugging in the USB. My heart hammered, each beat loud in my ears. Jacob sat back down, his hand finding mine, his fingers cold but firm. I squeezed back, my mind spinning. What was on that video? What had Dad said, and why had he hidden it until now? The laptop screen flickered to life, and I felt the room hold its breath. Every eye locked on that glowing square, waiting for the truth to break us all. The laptop hummed a low buzz that filled the silence as Mr. Harris clicked the file. My throat tightened, Jacob's cold fingers anchoring me to the moment. The screen flickered, then steadied, and there was Dad, his face filling the frame. He looked thinner than I remembered, his cheeks hollow, his eyes heavy with something I couldn't name. The room stilled, every breath held, as his voice crackled through the speakers, rough but clear. "If you're watching this, I'm gone. Emily Jacob, this is for you." My chest seized, a sob caught in my ribs. Dad's voice, so familiar yet so distant, reached into me, pulling at threads I'd buried deep. Ashley's chair creaked, her face a mask of shock, her hands clenched into fists. Raymond's jaw twitched, his eyes darting to the door like he wanted to bolt. Clara stared at the screen, her lips parted while Laura's bracelet lay silent, her usual smugness gone. Dad coughed, a dry rattle that echoed in my memory from nights I'd sat by his hospital bed. "Emily," he said, his gaze steady, piercing through the screen. I failed you, not the other way around. You were always enough more than I deserved. My vision blurred, tears spilling before I could stop them. Jacob's hand tightened, his small gasp cutting through my haze. I wanted to look at him to see his face, but I couldn't tear my eyes from Dad. He leaned closer, his hands trembling on the table in front of him. I let you believe you weren't enough, and I'll carry that regret forever. Jacob, you're the best thing she's done. Don't let anyone tell you different. His words landed like stones, each one breaking something inside me. I flashed back to a moment I'd forgotten, a rainy afternoon when I was 12, sitting on the porch with Dad. He'd been quiet watching the storm, and I'd asked why he was so hard on me. He'd sighed, ruffling my hair. I just want you to be strong, kid. I'd clung to that, hoping it meant love, but now it felt like a lie. Ashley's voice broke through, shrill and desperate. This is fake. He was sick, confused. He didn't mean this. She stood her chair, tipping back, her face flushed with panic. Nathan grabbed her arm, hissing something, but she shook him off, pointing at the screen. Turn it off. It's not part of the will. Mr. Harris hesitated, his hand hovering over the keyboard, but Dad's voice kept going, unyielding. I know they'll fight this, Dad said, his tone firm. Ashley Raymond, you've taken enough. Emily deserves her share, not because of money, but because she's my daughter. My heart stopped, the word daughter echoing in my skull. He'd never said it like that, with weight, with pride. I felt Jacob lean into me, his head against my arm, and I realized he was crying, soft hiccups muffled against my sleeve. Clara's voice cut in, low and venomous. This is nonsense. He never said this to us. He told me Emily was a mistake. Her words were a knife twisting in my gut, and I felt my body shake, a mix of rage and grief I couldn't contain. Laura nodded, her voice rising. She manipulated him, probably got him to record this when he was out of his mind. The room erupted, voices, overlapping accusations flying, each one a fresh wound. I wanted to scream, to tell them they were wrong, that Dad's words were real, but my voice was gone, stolen by the weight of their hate. Elise's eyes met mine wide, with something like shock, but she stayed silent, her hands knotted in her lap. Nathan's face was blank, his earlier smirk replaced by a cold distance. The room spun, their voices a cacophony, and Dad's face on the screen seemed to blur his words, fading under their onslaught. Mr. Harris raised a hand, his voice shaking. Please, we need order. This video may have legal weight. But no one listened. Ashley was yelling now, her words incoherent, while Raymond pounded the table, his face red. Clara's eyes burned into me, her accusation echoing a mistake. My whole life summed up in that word. Jacob's sobs grew louder, his face buried in my arm, and I felt myself crumbling, my heart raw, exposed, with nowhere left to hide. Jacob's sobs shook me, his small body pressed against my arm, and something inside me snapped into place. The room was a storm of voices, Ashley's shouts, Raymond's pounding fist, Clara's cold accusations, but Dad's words from the video echoed louder, a lifeline in the chaos. I wasn't a mistake. I was his daughter. My hands stopped shaking, and I felt a quiet strength rising like a fire I'd forgotten I could kindle. I wouldn't let them bury us in their lies. I stood my chair, scraping softly, and every eye turned to me. Ashley's voice faltered mid-sentence, her face twisting with disbelief. I didn't look at her, didn't look at Raymond or Clara. My gaze locked on Mr. Harris, his hand still raised, trying to calm the room. Mr. Harris, I said, my voice steady, surprising even me. That video changes everything. I want the will reevaluated, now. The room went quiet, a stunned hush that felt heavier than their shouts. Harris blinked, his glasses catching the light, and he nodded slowly like he was waking from a daze. "Ms. Thompson, I'll need to review the legal implications, but—" He hesitated, glancing at the laptop, where Dad's face was frozen on the screen, his eyes still piercing through me. The video appears authentic. Ashley lunged forward, her voice shrill. "You can't be serious. She's bluffing, trying to steal what's ours." Her words were desperate, her hands gesturing wildly, but I didn't flinch. I'd spent years shrinking from her, from all of them, but not now. Not with Jacob watching his tear-streaked face lifting to meet mine, his eyes wide with something like pride. I turned to Ashley, my voice low but firm. Dad spoke for himself. "You heard him. I'm not here to beg. I'm here for what's right." Her mouth opened, then closed, her cheeks flushing red. Nathan tugged at her sleeve, whispering something, but she yanked her arm away, her eyes burning into me. For the first time, I saw fear in her, and it fueled me, a spark catching flame. Elise spoke up, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the tension. "Ashley, you know Dad wasn't himself when you pushed him to rewrite the will." The room turned to her gasps, rippling through the family. Nathan's face paled, his hand dropping from Ashley's arm. Elise didn't look at him, her eyes steady on Mr. Harris. "I was there at the hospital." "You pressured him, Ashley. He didn't want this." My heart raced, Elise's words a shockwave. I flashed back to a hospital visit months before Dad died, when I'd found him staring out the window, his hands clutching the blanket. "I'm sorry, Emily," he'd said, his voice barely a whisper. I'd thought he was talking about his illness, but now I wondered if it was something else, something he couldn't say with Ashley hovering nearby. That memory steadied me, a piece of the puzzle clicking into place. Clara shifted her face tight, but she didn't speak. Laura's bracelet jingled once, a nervous twitch, and I caught her glancing at the door like she wanted to run. Raymond stood his chair toppling with a thud and stormed toward the exit, muttering under his breath. "This is a waste of time." The door slammed behind him, the sound echoing in my bones, but I didn't care. His absence felt like a victory, small but real. Jacob tugged my sleeve, his voice a whisper. "I knew Grandpa loved you, Mom." His words hit me like sunlight, warm and bright, and I knelt to hug him, my arms tight around his small frame. "You were so brave," I whispered back, my voice cracking. He nodded against my shoulder, and I felt his strength flow into me, a reminder of why I was fighting. I straightened, turning back to Mr. Harris. "I'd like a private meeting to discuss this further. Just you, me, and Jacob." My voice didn't waver, each word deliberate, a line drawn in the sand. "Mr. Harris nodded, jotting something down, his face unreadable, but his hands steady now. Ashley scoffed, crossing her arms, but her earlier fire was gone, replaced by a nervous edge. The room felt different, the balance shifting, and I stood taller, my heart pounding with a resolve I hadn't known I had. Ashley's scoff lingered, but I held Mr. Harris's gaze, my request for a private meeting still hanging in the air. The room felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. Jacob's hand was steady in mine, now his earlier tears replaced by a quiet resolve that mirrored my own. I'd spent years dodging their judgment, swallowing my voice to keep the peace. But Dad's video had cracked something open inside me. I wasn't just fighting for money. I was fighting for the truth, for Jacob, for the girl I'd been, who'd never stopped trying. Mr. Harris nodded, closing his folder with a soft snap. "We'll schedule a meeting, Ms. Thompson. I'll need to consult the video's legal standing." His voice was calm, professional, but I caught a flicker of respect in his eyes, something I hadn't seen before. It steadied me like a foothold on a steep climb. I sat down, my legs trembling not from fear, but from the weight of what I'd just done. Ashley spun toward Nathan, her voice low and furious. "You're not going to let her do this, are you?" "She's twisting everything." Nathan's face was a mask, his earlier ease gone replaced by a tight-lipped silence. He glanced at Elise, who sat still. Her hands folded her earlier words about Ashley's pressure hanging between them. The tension in their corner of the room was palpable, a fracture I hadn't expected, but welcomed. I flashed back to a moment I hadn't thought of in years, a quiet evening when I was 18, sitting in Dad's backyard. He'd been tinkering with an old radio, his hands steady despite the chemo. I'd been accepted to a local art program, a small victory I'd hoped he'd celebrate. I'd told him, my voice shaky with pride, but he'd only grunted. "Don't expect handouts, Emily. You've got to earn your place." I'd walked away hurt, but now I saw it differently. He'd been trying to teach me resilience even if he'd done it poorly. That memory fueled me now, a reminder I'd been earning my place all along. Clara cleared her throat, her voice softer than before. "Emily, maybe we should talk later. Just us." Her eyes met mine, not with warmth, but with a flicker of unease, like she was seeing me for the first time. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Clara had always been Dad's favorite sister, the one who'd shaped his view of me as the reckless one. Her offer felt like a crack in her armor, but I wasn't ready to trust it. Not yet. Laura stood, her purse clutched to her chest, and muttered something about needing air. Her exit was quieter than Raymond's, but it carried the same weight, a retreat from a battle she hadn't expected. The room felt lighter with her gone, the air less choked with her lies. I glanced at Jacob, his face brightening as he watched her leave, and I felt a surge of pride. He'd sparked this, his 7 words, shifting the ground beneath us all. I leaned down, whispering to him, "You changed everything you know, that." He smiled, small but real, and handed me the napkin he'd been clutching, now unfolded to reveal a new sketch. A tiny house with a heart above it. "For our shed," he said, his voice barely audible. My throat tightened, and I tucked the napkin into my pocket, a promise we'd build something new together. I turned back to Mr. Harris, my voice firm. "I want every document Dad left, every note, every draft. If there's more he wanted to say, I need to know." It wasn't just about the will anymore. It was about understanding him, piecing together the man who'd loved me in silence. Mr. Harris scribbled another note, his pen scratching loudly in the quiet room. "I'll gather everything he said," his tone decisive. Elise caught my eye, her nod subtle but clear. A silent alliance I hadn't expected. Nathan's shoulders slumped, his hands fidgeting, and I realized he was caught torn between Ashley's pull and the truth Elise had laid bare. The family I'd known was unraveling, their united front crumbling under the weight of Dad's words. I felt a strange calm, not victory, but clarity. I'd spent my life chasing their approval, but now I saw it for what it was, a cage I'd locked myself in. I stood again, slower this time, and took Jacob's hand. "We'll wait for your call, Mr. Harris." My voice was steady, each word a stone laid in a new foundation. I didn't look at Ashley, didn't need to see her anger or her fear. I walked toward the door, Jacob beside me. His sketch, a quiet weight in my pocket. As we stepped into the hallway, I paused, my eyes meeting his. He squeezed my hand, and in that small gesture, I felt the strength we'd built together. A bond no one could break. Weeks passed, and the air felt different, sharper, like the world had tilted slightly off its axis. Jacob and I sat in Mr. Harris's office again, this time alone, the room quieter without the family's venom. Papers were spread across the desk, Dad's will now open to a new page, a codicil Mr. Harris had found after the video. My hands rested in my lap, steady but heavy, as he read aloud, his voice measured. "In light of my recorded statement, I amend my will to grant Emily half the estate to be shared with Ashley." The words landed softly, but they shook me. Half the estate. Not the shed, not a token, but a real piece of Dad's legacy. Jacob's eyes widened, his small foot tapping under the chair, a nervous habit he'd picked up. I reached for his hand, my fingers brushing his, and felt a tremor of disbelief. I'd fought for truth, not money, but this felt like Dad reaching out, finally seeing me. Mr. Harris adjusted his glasses, his tone careful. This codicil was notarized separately, likely to keep it private until the video surfaced. He slid a document toward me, its edges worn, Dad's signature bold at the bottom. I stared at it, my throat tight, picturing him signing it in secret, maybe in the hospital. His hands weak, but his mind clear. Why hadn't he told me? Why hide this until now? I flashed back to a moment after Jacob was born, when I'd visited Dad at his office, hoping to mend things. I'd brought a photo of Jacob, his tiny face scrunched in sleep, and left it on Dad's desk. He'd picked it up, his eyes softening for a fleeting second, but then he'd set it down, turning back to his work. "You've got a lot on your plate now, Emily," he'd said, his voice distant. I'd left thinking he didn't care, but now I wondered if that photo had stayed with him, a quiet tether to us. Ashley's reaction came swiftly. A phone call that same evening, her voice sharp through the receiver. "You think you've won? I'll sue you into the ground, Emily. That video's a fraud." Her words were fierce, but there was a crack in them, a fear she couldn't hide. I stood in my kitchen, the phone pressed to my ear, Jacob coloring at the table nearby. "Do what you have to." "Ashley," I said, my voice calm, and hung up. I didn't need her approval anymore. I needed peace. Nathan called later, his tone softer, almost pleading. "Ashley's upset Emily. Maybe we can settle this quietly." I pictured him in his polished office, his tie loosened, caught between loyalty to Ashley and the truth Elise had exposed. "I'm not settling, Nathan," I said, my fingers tracing Jacob's drawing on the fridge, a bright sun over a lopsided house. Dad made his choice. He sighed, and the line went dead, his silence a concession I hadn't expected. The next day, I drove to the shed, Jacob in the back seat, his sketchbook open on his lap. The shed stood at the edge of the cabin's property, its roof sagging, weeds choking the path. I'd always seen it as a symbol of my failure, but now it felt different, like a challenge Dad had left me, not a punishment. I pushed open the creaking door, dust swirling in the sunlight, and found a wooden box tucked in a corner, its lid carved with my initials. Inside were Dad's journals, pages yellowed, filled with his tight, slanted handwriting. I sat on the floor, Jacob beside me, and opened one, my breath catching. "Emily's stronger than she knows," Dad had written years ago, after I'd moved out on my own. "She's raising that boy alone, and I'm proud even if I can't say it." My eyes stung, and I closed the journal, pressing it to my chest. Jacob leaned against me, his voice soft. "Grandpa wrote about you." I nodded, unable to speak, the weight of Dad's words settling into me. He'd seen me in his own broken way, and that knowledge was heavier than any inheritance. The shed's walls seemed to close in the air, thick with the scent of old wood and memories, and I felt a quiet shift, a truth I couldn't unlearn. But Ashley's threat loomed, her voice echoing in my mind, and I knew this wasn't over. The fight was just beginning, and I wasn't sure I was ready. The shed's quiet pressed against me, Dad's journal heavy in my hands. Jacob's question lingered, his small voice echoing in the dusty air. I set the journal down, my fingers brushing the carved initials on the box, a trace of Dad I hadn't expected to find. Outside, The wind rustled through the weeds, a soft hum that felt like the world holding its breath. I stood helping Jacob to his feet, and we stepped into the sunlight, the shed's shadow stretching long behind us. Clara's car was parked by the cabin when we returned, her silhouette visible through the window. She'd called earlier, asking to meet, her voice clipped but less sharp than before. I hesitated, then walked inside, Jacob trailing close. Clara sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded, no photos or smugness this time. "Emily," she said, her eyes meeting mine briefly before dropping. "I was wrong about you. I saw what I wanted to see." Her words were soft, but they landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading through me. I stood by the counter, my arms crossed, waiting for more. She fidgeted, her fingers twisting a thin silver ring. "I envied you, you know. You lived your life while I stayed in Dad's shadow." Her voice cracked, and I saw her for the first time, not as the aunt who judged me, but as a woman trapped by her own choices. I knotted my throat tight, but didn't speak. Forgiveness wasn't ready yet. Later that week, Elise texted a single line, "I'm sorry for staying quiet." She followed it with a photo, one she'd found in her attic, of Dad holding me as a toddler, his smile wide and unguarded. I stared at it, my chest aching, the image, a fragment of a love I'd doubted. I saved it to my phone, my fingers lingering on the screen, and felt a small piece of myself settle like a puzzle piece, finding its place. Ashley's threats continued, her lawyer sending a letter demanding the video's authenticity be challenged. I read it at my dining table, Jacob asleep upstairs, the house quiet, except for the tick of the clock. The letter's words were cold legal, but I saw her fear between the lines, her need to control a story she was losing. I set it aside, my hands steady, and poured a glass of water, the glass cool against my palm. I wasn't afraid of her anymore. The community center where I worked buzzed with whispers, Laura's rumors having spread through town. A co-worker, Jenny, pulled me aside, her voice low. "People are saying you tricked your dad for money." Her eyes were kind, but the words stung, a reminder of how far Laura's lies had reached. I smiled, tight-lipped, and said, "Let them talk." But inside, I felt the weight of their judgment, a shadow I couldn't fully shake. I drove to the shed again, alone this time, needing its quiet. Inside, I found another journal, this one from when I was a teenager. Dad had written about a fight we'd had when I'd stormed out after he'd criticized my grades. "She's stubborn like me," he'd noted, "but she's got a heart bigger than mine." I sat on the floor, the journal open in my lap, and let the tears come silent and slow. He'd seen me even then, but never told me. The ache of that silence was a wound I'd carry forever. Jacob and I started sketching plans for the shed, taping paper to the kitchen table, our pencils scratching in unison. He wanted a skylight so the stars can watch us paint. I laughed the sound foreign after weeks of tension and added it to the list. The shed wasn't just a gift now. It was ours, a space to rebuild. But as we worked, Ashley's letter sat on my desk, a reminder of the fight still looming. I glanced at Jacob, his head bent over his drawing, and felt a quiet dread settle in my chest. We'd won something, but the cost was a family I'd never fully had, and the loss of that hope stung deeper than I'd expected. Months later, the shed stood transformed, its sagging roof patched, the walls scrubbed clean and painted a soft cream. Jacob and I had spent weekends hauling out junk sanding beams, turning the cramped space into a studio that smelled of fresh lumber and possibility. I stood inside now, a canvas propped on an easel, my brush dipping into a pot of deep blue. The morning light slanted through a new window, catching flecks of dust that danced like tiny stars. Jacob was at school, his laughter still echoing in my mind from breakfast, where he'd spilled orange juice and giggled through his apology. I painted slowly strokes steady, each one a quiet rebellion against the years I'd doubted myself. The canvas showed a lake at dusk, its surface rippling under a fading sky, a scene I'd imagined but never seen. It wasn't about Dad or the family anymore. It was mine, a piece of me I'd reclaimed. I stepped back, wiping my hands on a rag, and felt a calm settle in, soft but sure, like the moment after a long exhale. Elise's visit came unexpectedly, her knock pulling me from my work. She stood in the doorway, a small box in her hands, her smile hesitant but warm. "I found something you should have," she said, stepping inside. The box held a single photograph worn at the edges of me at 5, sitting on Dad's shoulders at a county fair. My grin was wide, my hands clutching his hair, and he was laughing. His eyes crinkled with a joy I'd forgotten he could show. Elise's voice was quiet. "I thought you'd want this, to remember him like that." I held the photo, my throat tight, and nodded. "Thank you." I managed my voice barely above a whisper. Elise lingered, her fingers brushing the edge of a table where Jacob's sketches were pinned. "You've built something here," she said, her eyes sweeping the room. "It's more than they ever did." Her words weren't loud, but they carried weight, a bridge between us that hadn't existed before. I offered her coffee, and we sat, the silence between us comfortable, like old friends finding their way back. That night, I sifted through memories, not the painful ones, but the small, overlooked ones. I remembered a winter when I was 9, Dad teaching me to ice skate on a frozen pond. I'd fallen scraping my knees, and he'd knelt beside me, his gloves warm against my hands. "You're tougher than you think, kid," he'd said, his voice gruff but kind. I'd held on to that even when his approval faded, and now it felt like a seed that had finally sprouted, green and fragile but alive. Jacob came home with a new drawing, a watercolor of the shed under a starry sky. The skylight he'd insisted on glowing bright. For our show, he said, his eyes shining. We'd decided to host an art show, just us and a few locals, to share what we'd built. I pinned his painting next to mine, the two pieces side by side, a testament to our shared strength. I hugged him, his small arms tight around me, and felt a peace I hadn't known I could claim. Clara's letter arrived the next day, a single page in her careful handwriting. No apology, just a note wishing me well, saying she'd heard about the studio. "You're doing what Dad never could," she wrote, and I read it twice, searching for her meaning. I set it aside, not ready to respond, but the words stayed with me, a faint echo of change I hadn't expected. The shed's quiet wrapped around me, the canvas waiting, and I picked up my brush again, the blue paint cool against my fingers, ready to keep going. The shed's walls glowed under the afternoon sun, the fresh paint catching light like a promise kept. I stood outside, a bucket of wildflowers in my hand, their stems damp from the meadow nearby. Jacob had picked them, insisting they'd brighten the studio for our art show. I arranged them in a chipped vase, the kind Dad might have tossed, and set it by the door. The simple act felt like a stitch in a wound, small but healing, tying me to this place we'd made ours. Inside, I hung Jacob's latest sketch, a bright swirl of greens and yellows next to my lake painting. His lines were bolder now, less hesitant, and I saw his heart in every stroke. I stepped back, my hands smudged with chalk from pinning the paper, and felt a quiet pride, not just for him, but for us. We'd turned a crumbling shack into a home for our dreams, something no one could take away. I sat on a stool, the wood creaking under me, and pulled out the photo Elise had given me, the one of Dad and me at the fair. I traced his smile, my finger lingering on the creases by his eyes. I didn't hate him anymore, not for his silence or his mistakes. He'd been human, flawed like me, and loving me in ways I hadn't understood. I tucked the photo into a drawer, not to hide it, but to let it rest, a memory I could carry without pain. A neighbor, Sarah, stopped by, her arms full of flyers for the art show. She'd offered to spread the word, her voice warm with excitement. "This is special, Emily. You and Jacob, you're showing us what matters." I smiled, handing her a glass of iced tea, and we stood by the window, watching the breeze ripple the grass outside. Her words settled into me not as praise, but as truth, a mirror reflecting the woman I'd become. I thought back to a spring day when I was 14, sitting in Dad's car after a school play. I'd played a minor role, a tree, but I'd poured myself into it, hoping he'd notice. He'd driven in silence, then said, "You looked happy up there." It wasn't much, but it was his way, and I'd held it close, a flicker of light in the dark. Now that memory didn't hurt. It was just part of him, part of me, and I could let it be. Jacob burst through the door, his backpack swinging, his voice bright. "Mom, I told my teacher about the show. She's coming." I laughed, pulling him into a hug. His energy, a spark that lit me up. We sat together, planning the show's details, our voices mingling with the hum of crickets outside. I showed him how to mix paints, his small hands clumsy but eager. And I saw Dad in him, not the weight of his expectations, but the quiet love he'd tried to give. As the sun dipped low, I stepped outside, the air cool against my skin. The meadow stretched wide, its colors softening in the dusk. I closed my eyes, letting the wind brush my face, and felt the past slip further away, not gone, but lighter, like a stone smoothed by a river. Jacob called me back inside, his voice a tether to now, and I went. My steps slow, my heart steady, ready for whatever came next. The art show was simple. Just a handful of folks gathered in the shed, their voices soft against the hum of evening crickets. String lights looped above us, casting a warm glow over the canvases lining the walls. I stood by the door, a cup of lemonade in my hand, watching Jacob weave through the crowd. His smile bright as he showed Sarah his latest painting. The air smelled of fresh paint and cut grass, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. I'd hung my work carefully, each piece a step forward, not perfect, but honest. There was a small painting of a single tree, its branches bare, but reaching, rooted in cracked earth. It wasn't flashy, but it was me, the parts I'd hidden for too long. A neighbor, Tom, paused in front of it, his head tilted.
"This one's got soul,"
he said. His voice quiet, and I knotted my throat tight with gratitude, not for the praise, but for being seen. Elise was there, her presence steady, like a friend who'd always been meant to stay. She brought a tray of cookies, her laugh mingling with the chatter, and I caught her eye across the room. We didn't need words. Her nod said enough, a quiet promise of support that felt stronger than family ties. Clara came too, standing at the edges, her hands clasped tight. She didn't speak, but her being there was a step one I didn't need to force or chase. I moved through the crowd, my steps light, listening to snippets of conversation, laughter, the clink of glasses. Jacob tugged at my sleeve, pulling me to his corner where he'd taped up a new sketch, a bright burst of colors he called Our Future. I knelt beside him, my hand on his shoulder, and felt a warmth spread through me, not loud, but deep, like a fire banked for the night. He was my anchor, my reason, and I knew I'd fight for this life we'd built, no matter what came. I thought back to a moment long ago, A quiet Sunday when I was 7, sitting on the kitchen floor with Mom before she passed. She'd been baking her hands dusted with flour, and I'd asked why she always hummed while she worked. "It keeps the heart steady," she'd said, smiling. I hadn't understood then, but now I did. I'd found my own hum in the brush of paint, in Jacob's laughter, in the small acts that made me whole. The shed felt alive, its walls holding our story, not just the pain, but the rebuilding. I stepped outside for a moment, the night cool against my skin, the stars sharp above the meadow. I closed my eyes, letting the breeze carry away the last traces of the will reading the years of doubt. I wasn't the girl who'd sat in that lawyer's office trembling under their words. I was here now, standing on ground I'd claimed not given. Back inside, I watched Jacob hand out crayons to a couple of kids, their giggles filling the space. I leaned against the wall, the wood solid under my shoulder, and let the moment sink in. The hurt hadn't vanished, but it didn't own me anymore. I was learning to live with it, to carry it lightly like a scar that had faded with time. The night stretched on, and I stayed rooted, ready for whatever came next. The art show wound down, the crowd thinning as the night deepened. I stood by the easel, my hands folded, watching Jacob stack his crayons in a neat row, his small face focused. The shed was quieter now, the hum of voices replaced by the rustle of leaves outside. I caught Clara's eye as she slipped out her nod, brief but real, a silent acknowledgement I hadn't expected. I didn't need her approval, but her presence felt like a loose thread finely tied off, not tight, just enough to rest. I walked to the back of the shed, where a small shelf held a single candle, its flame steady in the still air. I'd lit it earlier, a whim, but now it felt like a marker, a light for the road I'd traveled. I thought of Dad, not the man who'd judged me, but the one who'd tried in his clumsy way to love me. I'd spent so long chasing his validation, letting it shape me, but standing here, I saw it clearly. I'd been enough all along, not because of him, but because of me. Jacob came over his sneakers, scuffing the floor, and handed me a folded paper. "I wrote something," he said, his voice shy. I opened it, my eyes scanning his careful handwriting, a poem about a boy and his mom building a house under the stars. Each line was simple, but it carried his heart, and mine broke open not with pain, but with a love so fierce it felt like flying. I hugged him, my cheek against his hair, and whispered, "This is beautiful, kid." I stepped outside, the meadow dark, now the air cool and sharp. I thought of Mom again, not her baking or her humming, but a moment when I was 6, lying in bed with a fever. She'd sat beside me, her hand cool on my forehead, and said, "You're stronger than you know, Emily. You'll find your way." I hadn't believed her then, but now I did. Strength wasn't loud or showy. It was showing up day after day, choosing to build even when the ground felt unsteady. The lesson came to me quietly, like a truth I'd always known but hadn't named. Love can be silent, imperfect, even hidden, but it's never absent. Dad's love was in his journals, in the shed, in the way he'd trusted me to stand up when it mattered. And my love for Jacob, for myself, was in this moment, in the life we'd carved out. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. I just needed to live it, to trust my worth, and let it carry me forward. I went back inside, the candle's glow soft against the walls. Jacob was curled in a chair, his eyes heavy, his poem still in my hand. I tucked it into my pocket, a keepsake of this night, this turning point. The shed felt like a sanctuary, not because it was perfect, but because it was ours, built from our hands, our hearts. I blew out the candle, the smoke curling upward, and closed the door, ready to step into tomorrow. What's a moment that made you realize your own strength? I'd love to hear your story in the comments to know what's carried you through. If this journey resonated, please hit like, subscribe, or share it with someone who might need it. Your support means the world, and I'm grateful for every one of you joining me here. Thank you for listening, and I wish you peace wherever you are tonight.